want the lights to go down.
Okay, you do. So you want to set it up as the... do you want the lights on here or just here?
No, just here.
Just here. So when you're ready to do that, you'll just
I'm
put...
ready to do it right now. I'm ready
okay.
to press one, two.
So 4. Okay. Do you want the lights here, Dan?
Yep.
Great. Well, good evening, everyone. On behalf of our Chancellor, Matthew Goldstein, and our President, Bill Kelly, and the Dean of the Journalism School at City University, Steve Shepard, I want to welcome you to our Graduate Center. And my name is Michael Arena. I am a professor of journalism at the CUNY School of Journalism, and I'm also a director for the University for Communications. And I want to say that, first of all, the Journalism School is very, very much pleased to participate in this solemn remembrance and celebration of one brave woman and her extraordinary work. Tonight, we gather together to revisit a long sequence of unspeakable events and crimes, and we search for meaning, and we also search for some reason for hope. Clearly, we live in a time when courageous journalists are giving their lives in Chechnya and elsewhere. And of course, we all know here in the US and in peaceful climes that the craft itself is under extreme distress. But I want to share with you a ray of hope, not to be too corny, from my own experience at City University and at the Journalism School, where just a few years ago, some of our critics, when we announced that we were going to start a new school of journalism, at best called us counterintuitive, and at worst, well, we won't say at worst what it was. But we knew at that time that a new school was needed. It was needed now, especially in these times. Just a little bit of background. Our university encompasses, it's a public university for those of you who don't know, 5 boroughs. We now have 260,000 students, which is a very large number in all 5 boroughs. But the real interesting fact that I was recently reminded of is that 46% of those students are foreign-born. We serve a very large population of new Americans and immigrants. And so it was really not all that unnatural for us to be optimistic and to look forward and to say that we needed a journalism school at this time because of the unique role that we play here in New York, not only for our New Yorkers who were born here, but also for our immigrant New Yorkers and our New Yorkers who were born elsewhere. So what happened at that point when we started, I think, was we found something which we sort of knew we would find, because at the very time when the outlook was perhaps its bleakest in the industry, in the craft, we found that a new young generation had a very intense desire to participate in this craft. And that's not only true for us, but if you look around, you'll see that journalism schools across the nation are experiencing a surge in interest. At CUNY, for example, we're 3 years into it. We're attracting somewhere in the order of 600 applicants a year. Now in our 3rd year, we have 130 or so students enrolled. And we are attracting students who are applying to the top schools in the country in a very short period of time. And perhaps most helpful is the fact that these are our students. They're bright, they're curious, they're hardworking, they're diverse, and they have 2 strong areas of interest: local reporting and foreign reporting. Many of them have signed up from concentrations of both local and foreign reporting. And as any good journalist knows, all foreign reporting is local. So with that in mind, I want to again welcome you and welcome you to this marvelous CUNY Graduate Center, and step back and begin the program. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Larry Seams. I'm the director of the Freedom to Write and International Programs at Penn American Center. I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank Human Rights Watch, the Committee to Protect Journalists, Witness, CUNY School of Journalism, and the Martin E. Siegel Theater Center, our partners for this event. And I'd especially like to thank the Open Society Institute for its generous support for the program. Once again, as Michael said, we are here both to mourn and to celebrate. In December 2006, we gathered in this very room to pay tribute to Anna Politkovskaya, who was murdered 3 years ago this month, shot dead in a contract killing in the elevator of her apartment building in Moscow. With us that evening was Natalia Estemirova, who had come directly from Grozny to talk with David Remnick about Anna, her courage, and her work. That night, she said, "There were very many places Anna would go where no one else would go. You couldn't tell Anna, don't go there, it's dangerous. You couldn't say, we're afraid for you, because if you did, she would say, well, no, then I have to go there, and she would go." What made her different from other journalists? Usually it is the journalists who are the hero of some sort, but their heroism ends at the end of the article they write. But that's not at all how it was for Anna. She could not remain indifferent or forget about the person she was writing about. She would try to help the person, perhaps by giving money if they were in need, or by using her influence, or simply through her incomparable courage. What Natalia Estemirova didn't say, of course, was that every place that Anna Politkovskaya ventured, Natalia had already been there, very likely many times, and that every time Anna Politkovskaya returned to Moscow, Natalia remained in Grozny, digging, documenting abuses for the human rights organization Memorial, and publishing truths that put her own life at risk. If Anna Politkovskaya's courage was incomparable, and it was, I'm not sure there's a word for the courage of Natalia Estemirova. It is extremely clear to me that those who killed Anna thought that by killing her they were silencing her, but that is not the case, she said optimistically that night, because now in Novaya Gazeta, in the space where her articles were published, there will be articles and information from Memorial. As you will hear tonight, it was Natalia herself who filled that space and who would pay the price. Before being drawn to human rights work, Natalia Estemirova was a teacher. At dinner after our event 3 years ago, she talked not about torture and abductions and the horrible costs of the Chechen wars, but about pedagogy and school funding and brilliant and incorrigible pupils. You got the sense that her transformation into one of the world's leading human rights defenders wasn't a transformation at all, but rather an extension of her commitment to her students and her refusal to ignore or accept the dangers that awaited them. Tonight we'll hear some of Natalia's writings, see some video clips of her at work, and assess progress in the struggle to bring Anna Politkovskaya's killers and now her killers to justice. And we will have a chance to listen to two others who have arrived today from the front lines in Russia, Tanya Lokshina from Human Rights Watch's Moscow office, and Elena Milashina, a journalist from Novaya Gazeta. They will have a conversation with Ann Cooper about Natalia's work and the climate for freedom of expression and human rights activism in Russia, and in the Caucasus in particular, where 3 more human rights defenders have been murdered since Natalia's murder in July, the most recent just this past Sunday. The best way to honor Natalia Estemirova, I believe, is to ask the kind of questions she would have asked and to make it our own task to look for the answers. I encourage you to join PEN, Human Rights Watch, the Committee to Protect Journalists, and Witness in our efforts to bring human rights abuses to light, and to add your voice to the chorus of voices around the world that is calling for a full investigation and prosecutions for her murder. There is a sample letter in your programs tonight that I hope you'll take home and fill out and send in. With that, thank you all for coming, and enjoy the program.
Hello, I'm Salman Rushdie. I'm going to be reading an excerpt from Natalya's article, Wild Garlic Gatherers, which was published in the newspaper Novaya Gazeta on April the 2nd, 2007. Every year, beginning in January, sacks full of fat green shoots appear in the markets of Chechnya, Ingushetia, and Dagestan. They are sold by tired women with weather-beaten faces, who have pulled up the stalks of wild garlic by hand from under the snow in mountain forests, which are crammed with landmines. Every year, terrible news sweeps into the town of women who have been blown up, fired upon, or who have just disappeared. This year's season was coming to an end, and it seemed as though we would get by without casualties. We didn't. It was a Saturday, the first day of the school vacation. Kaldat, an elementary school teacher, had decided to go to the forest with her sister Zalpa and Zalpa's daughter-in-law Zaira to gather wild garlic to eat and to sell. Usually, women go out for wild garlic in a panel truck, but 2 nights before, armed men in camouflage had entered Kaldat's driver's house and told him not to drive into the forest anymore if he didn't want to be considered an insurgent. He was reluctant to disobey, so the women set out on foot. They didn't have very far to go anyway. About 500 meters from the village is Blue Lake. Many people come here from the villages, and dozens of paths have been trampled into the woodsy tangle around the lake. The women left the house at 8:30. At exactly 9 o'clock, Zara called her relative Vakha. "Help," she pleaded. "They're shooting at us, and we're wounded. We're next to Blue Lake, not far from the village. Save us." Kaldat's sister later described what happened by the lake. "We'd been walking for about 20 minutes, and we were still pretty close to the village," Zalpa said. "We came out into a clearing. All of a sudden, I heard a submachine gun being shouldered, and then immediately after, a burst of fire. They were shooting from different directions. First my sister fell, then my daughter-in-law Zaira. I dove to the ground. They fired for a long time. First I cried out, then I stopped. Then they hit me. I told my daughter-in-law to call home to get help. Then I told her to turn off the phone and lie there as if she was dead. My sister was already unconscious. I heard the soldiers saying something, but all I could make out was, 'Let's go.' But they didn't. I was lying with my back to them and my eyes were shut. I was afraid they'd finish me off. Then I decided to try talking to them. I was afraid that when our men came to help, the shooting would start again. When I raised my head, they were sitting around us, submachine guns ready. I raised up on an elbow and said, 'Why did you fire at us when we were going to pick garlic?' One started binding our wounds. They put my sister and daughter-in-law on a tarp, picked them up, and started down. Our men met us coming the other way. Their elder said, 'Now they're going to put us on trial, and we shouted at you to warn you.' 'What do you mean shouted? I would have heard you shouting if I could hear you shouldering a submachine gun.' 'It was foggy, we couldn't see you,' the elder said. 'There wasn't any fog, it was just cloudy. You should have looked through your binoculars. Is that any way to shoot?' The men got to Blue Lake in about 10 minutes. Walking towards them were the soldiers. 8 of them were carrying Kaldat and Zaira. Zalpa, wounded in the shoulder, was walking unaided. Seeing the men, the soldiers lowered the stretchers. Some took up battle positions, and the others scattered. The men were furious. 'What happened? Why did you shoot at women?' our men asked. 'We thought they were insurgents,' was the answer. Kaldat was buried on Sunday. The women wailed and the men prayed. Standing pressed close together were the children, Kaldat's pupils. They were crying in horror and despair, and the school's director could do nothing to calm them down. Speaking powerless words of comfort, he agonized over who would teach these children after the vacation. There were no teachers. Kaldat had already been doing the job of 2. Who would replace her?
I'm Tanya Lokshina, and I'll be reading from Man's Revenge, published in Novaya Gazeta on the 18th of October, 2007. Chechen women won their war and were immediately told to hide their faces. On the eve of the month of Ramadan, while announcing the upcoming fast, Chechen President Ramzan Kadyrov proclaimed that all women working in state institutions would now be required to wear headscarves. Men were not required to do anything differently, even though, according to Islam and Chechen tradition, appearing in public with an uncovered head is just as impermissible for them as it is for women. Some women have not taken this new ruling seriously. This is not the first time that they heard their wish being expressed. One disobedient woman in particular, a university teacher, appeared for her lectures with an uncovered head. They would not let her enter the building of the university, and she had to call her husband quickly and ask him to bring her a headscarf. That's how it goes. In another Russia's republic, Tatarstan, women are fighting for the right to wear a scarf. But in Chechnya, those who don't want to wear it are being fought. It is a strange thing. As soon as the men in Chechnya start talking about independence for themselves, they also immediately demand that women put on scarves. This is how it was back in 1991, before the so-called revolution, and again between 1997 and 1999. Ultimately, this is a bad sign. A year and a half ago, Ramzan Kadyrov, then still Prime Minister, also announced the benefit of scarves and the harmful influence of cell phones on young girls' morale. He handed out $1,000 each to a few exemplary young women. One of them refused to accept the gift and explained that she wore the scarf, not because someone required her to do so, but because she herself liked it. During the war years, while the men were killing and destroying, women were bearing children, drawing water, and baking bread. Despite all the obstacles, they found work to support their families, supplied their blockaded villages with food, and rushed to the rescue when their men were detained during sweeps. Often, women also took pity on Russian soldiers, who they felt were as much victims of the war as they were. After the war, Chechen men realized that the woman's role in society had grown. Now, they are taking revenge by demanding a return to tradition in the form of a headscarf. According to Caucasian traditions, only a close relative, father, husband, or brother, can order a woman to do or not to do something. But now it seems that all of Chechnya's men have ceded their right to one Ramzan Kadyrov. It is proper, after all. A female friend of mine, a deputy minister in Chechnya, says, even though I don't like wearing a headscarf, it's time to do it. We sin so much, and the Prophet taught us to cover our head. I thought, if only all the other teachings of the Quran were followed so unanimously today. The month of Ramadan is over. Permission to remove headscarves has not followed. The hair of young women television announcers is still tucked under kerchiefs.
On October the 4th, 2007, Natalia was honored with the inaugural Anna Politkovskaya Award. Anna, a courageous journalist for the independent newspaper Novaya Gazeta, was murdered on October the 7th, 2006, in her apartment building in Moscow. She had worked tirelessly with Natalia to uncover the truth of the atrocities being committed in Chechnya and made them known to the world despite 7 years of threats against her life. I will now read an excerpt from Natalia's acceptance speech. October the 4th, 2007. They met in November 2003, the famous journalist Anna Politkovskaya and the policeman Sergei Lapin in a tumble-down court building in Grozny. He was accompanied by an escort of several armored personnel carriers, APCs, which surrounded the building. She was with several of her friends, each of whom had suffered in one way or another at the hands of Lapin and his associates. He was on trial, and the very fact that this had actually happened was largely due to Anna. 2 years earlier, Anna had met the Murdalov family whose only son, Zelim Khan, had disappeared. At the time, Chechen police were considered incapable of maintaining law and order in Chechnya, and police had been brought in from Khanty-Mansijsk in the north of Russia. The Khantys had moved into a building that housed a boarding school for deaf children. In January 2001, they dragged 26-year-old Zelim Khan Murdalov there. He was tortured and tormented for several hours in an attempt to turn him into an informant. Then, when he was semi-conscious, he was thrown into a cell. The following morning, the dying Murdalov was dragged out again. That was the last time anyone saw him. How many other corpses had they taken out of the building that year? The Khantys themselves would probably find it difficult to recall. But it is clear that dozens disappeared in the boarding school and its vicinity. Shocked by the despair of Zelim Khan's mother and impressed by his father's resolve, Anna wrote an article titled The Disappearance, in which she named Sergei Lapin as one of the culprits for the first time. When witnesses began to talk in her articles, the horrific details of what Lapin had done to various detainees sent shivers down many readers' spines. Although Anna's newspaper received a letter threatening her, Anna turned her attention to the Murdalov family, who were in obvious danger. The family lived in the 2 rooms still standing in the ruins of their house. From the street, you could see through the bullet and shell holes right into the Murdalov's house. It was in that house that Anna stayed on her several visits to Chechnya. No, she was not reckless. She was well aware of the gravity of the situation. When the situation became too dangerous, Anna succeeded in getting Zelim Khan's mother, Ruqyat, and his sister, Zalina, out of Russia. By then, they had managed to achieve the unimaginable. The main suspect in their son's disappearance, Sergei Lapin, who had done his best to intimidate Anna as well, had been detained and brought to Grozny. After that, she stayed only with friends. I was always afraid when complete strangers approached her in the street to talk to her. But she wasn't afraid to stay with me in my flat, even though there was no glass in the windows and the door had been broken down several times by the Russian army and looters and was no thicker than an eggshell. Lapin did not spend long in detention. The prosecutor found him to be a low-risk case, and he was released into his own custody. Immediately afterwards, the 30 most important documents relating to his case mysteriously disappeared. Had it not been for Anna's angry articles, the case would have been lost. But Anna managed to publish copies of the disappeared papers, and then several of them, oddly, turned up later in the prosecutor's office. So time passed, and it was in that courtroom in autumn 2003 when Anna and Lapin finally looked each other in the eye. She looked straight at him, but he kept averting his eyes, unsure of himself in her presence, even when protected by armed bodyguards. Yet when the judge finally ordered the officers of the court to put handcuffs on him a year and a half later at one of the hearings, Anna was not there. The situation in Chechnya had become too dangerous for her, and her friends had asked her to stay away. Her editor also forbade her from getting there. She had worked so hard on this case. She had found Stanislav Markelov, the only lawyer in Moscow who would agree to go to Grozny. She had persuaded Amnesty International to pay his fees because the Murdalovs did not have the money. She had even gotten all the Russian TV channels to broadcast the trial. Finally, the judge pronounced the sentence, 11 years for torture and humiliation. But Anna only learned about it from Stas, the lawyer. Anna was murdered on October the 7th, 2006. On October the 26th, the Supreme Court overturned Lapin's conviction. A new trial is now going on in Grozny. Once again, we hear witness statements about the events in the cells of the boarding school that made our hearts miss a beat. And once again, we have to persuade witnesses to come forward despite possible repercussions. So who are the winners? There are none. Yet thousands of young people's lives have been saved, even though they may never get to know it. The building where people were maimed and murdered is no longer there. They pulled it down, allegedly to build a new boarding school for the deaf. This was over a year ago. The deaf children are still making do with a few small rooms in a private house, while the wasteland that was once the boarding house is overgrown with weeds. There are those with a vested interest in keeping this Russian Abu Ghraib forgotten, so that they can once again kidnap and torture. Our task, however, is to uncover their deeds and to fight them. Anna was at the forefront of this work for many years. She is no more. Now it is up to us to continue her work.
I'm Michael Arena, and I'll be reading from one of Natalia's last articles, Thousands of Executioners at Large, published by Novaya Gazeta on January 21st, 2009. Stas has been killed. I can't believe it. Lanky, fun, foolhardy, mischievous. He never let anything get in his way. The last time I spoke with him on the telephone was a few days ago. We talked about Elza Kungava and her case. He first came to Grozny with Anna Poliskova. He was an attorney for Asmir Mudalov, whose son Zelnikan was brutally beaten at Grozny's October District Police Station in 2001. After the beating, Zelnikan disappeared. Only one suspect was ever brought to trial, Sergei Lapin. The trial did not begin until late 2003 and only ended in March of 2005. That Lapin was sentenced at all is to Stanislav Makavelov's credit. For more than a year, the judge could not even bring himself to order Lapin to be taken into custody. At times, amazingly, the prosecutor acted as Lapin's attorney. Only thanks to Saz's talent, persistence, and fearlessness was Lapin finally convicted. This is the rarest of incidents, when an executioner sent to enforce the Constitution gets real prison time for a crime committed in Chechnya. Thousands of executioners who have murdered and have crippled ordinary citizens in the name of the state are still at large, thanks to investigators who for years would not question criminals, thanks to judges who believed that these criminals would meekly await sentencing at liberty, and thanks to courageous police who refused to chase them down on Russia's broad expanses. Who was Stas interfering with? Minin and Prepelin and Lapin's bosses, who the investigator did not consider necessary to hold responsible? It was only in court, thanks to Markelov's magnificent work, that their guilt was even disclosed, and that they were wanted by the police, who still supposedly are looking for them, by the way. Stas lived enthusiastically, no second thoughts. He daringly accepted any difficult case, especially when an innocent person needed defending. He hated violence, the personification of which for him was fascism. I only saw Stanislaw angry once, and that was when people frivolously spoke about violence in front of him. That was when I realized why he threw himself into battle so desperately against those who create evil. For him, they were all fascists. The fight against fascism, no matter what shape it took, be it a skinhead teen or an inveterate soldier, was Stanislaw's life. For this, he was not afraid to come to a ruined city where landmines were still going off, where APCs were driving up buildings into the middle of the night, and where people were going missing. No matter their rank, Stas was never afraid to denounce anyone. He didn't run when he started getting very real text messages threatening his life. Markelov's murder is a declaration of war. Now the question is, on which side is the state?
Меня зовут Наталья Естемирова. Я сотрудник правозащитного центра «Мемориал». Я работаю в Грозном. Я начала работать систематически в нашем правозащитном центре с 20 марта 2000 года. И это была очень тяжелая работа. И со временем она меняется. То есть если сначала нужно было выезжать в села, которые или только бомбили, или только что произошло. Я узнала о гибели одного из них. Когда я узнала, что другой мой ученик находится в тюрьме и его пытали. Я узнала еще об одном ученике, что сейчас он сам работает в таком заведении, где пытают людей, и, возможно, сам имеет отношение к пыткам. Вот это, конечно, бывают нерадостные моменты. Впервые мы сказали людям, вы имеете право обратиться в Страсбургский суд, чаще всего нас его называют так. Значит, мы рассказали людям в 2000 году. Одно из первых дел было дело по убийству мирных жителей Валдау. И я помню, как лица тех заявителей, которые выиграли это дело, на этих лицах не было радости. Им сказали о том, что это государство будет наказано. Оно будет наказано денежным штрафом. Но у людей это тоже не вызывало радости, потому что они хотели самого главного, чтобы были наказаны преступники. Но на лицах их была надежда, потому что они и до сих пор надеются. И теперь, что наконец-то государство должно будет найти тех, кто убивал, тех, кто виновен. И что наконец-то они посмотрят в глаза тем, кто тогда издевался над ними. Вот это было для них главным. И то же самое для всех других заявителей в Страсбургский суд. Сейчас выиграно уже больше 30 дел в Страсбургском суде. И это очень важно для людей. И вот, как я уже сказала, во-первых, важно услышать, что не виноваты жертвы. И то, что суд этот дает надежду на то, что преступления будут расследованы. И самое главное, что больше такого не будет, что больше не будут безнаказанно убивать, что больше не будут безнаказанно бомбить села, похищать людей. Потому что теперь есть организация, которая может спросить за это и потребовать наказать виновных. И Страсбургский суд имеет для жителей Чечни огромное значение.
My name is Keith Gessen. I've been asked to talk about the Anna Politkovskaya trial, which I wrote about from the New Yorker. Anna Politkovskaya was killed on a Saturday as she was coming home with some groceries. It was a weekend. She was not on her regular schedule, but her shooter entered the building just minutes before she came in and waited for her, indicating that she was being followed. He shot her 4 times after she entered the elevator, dropped his gun, and quietly left the building. She was discovered by a neighbor who called the elevator up to the 8th floor. A year ago, 2 years after she was killed, the people charged in her killing were brought to trial in Moscow. Investigators appeared to have a strong case. Politkovskaya was living at the time on a fairly busy street in the center of Moscow. The building was surrounded by cameras. In addition to the camera outside the door-to-door entryway, which showed the killer, a thin man in a baseball cap entering the building, and then it showed Politkovskaya coming up to the building, going in, and then a few minutes later it showed the killer coming out. There were at least 6 other cameras in the vicinity. Several of the cameras had captured what was almost definitely the killer's car. The crime lab was able to figure out the car's license plate. The car was found in a Moscow garage. The owner of the car, a Chechen man named Rustam Mahmudov, had fled, but 2 of his brothers, who were in Moscow at the time, had been taken into custody. Police had cell phone records, or they claimed to have cell phone records, which showed that the brothers were near the scene of the crime on the day that it happened, and under questioning they could give no explanation for why they'd been there. And that was not all they had. They had a police officer, a detective, whom another police officer accused of asking him to work on Politkovskaya a month before she was shot. They had an FSB officer, which is the successor agency to the KGB, who had told investigators that a Chechen businessman had asked him to look up Politkovskaya's address in their database, in the FSB database, also a month before the shooting. Investigators said that they had evidence of contacts between all of these people at separate times. So these were not just a bunch of people they'd picked up in a bar somewhere. A day before the defense began to present its case, Stanislav Markelov, who we heard about just a few minutes ago, was shot in the head in broad daylight in the center of Moscow, about a mile from the courtroom. So there was a moral climate, there was a news climate, and there was a political climate for finding these people guilty. And I came in convinced, when I went to the trial, that I was going to look into the face of the people who had participated in the killing of Anna Politkovskaya. That's not what happened. The case fell apart very quickly. The first defense testimony was from the younger of the Makhmudov brothers, who turned out not to be a lowlife, but a guy who was applying to graduate school. He had written his senior thesis on the Chechen refugee problem. He knew who Politkovskaya was, and he was a total sweetheart. The prosecution's case against the 2 brothers, who were supposedly in the vicinity of the crime, relied very heavily on cell phone records. But it turned out there were a great many problems with the records, which the lead defense attorney, a young Chechen named Murad Musayev, began to uncover as the trial went along. The calls did not line up. So you had outgoing calls from one brother, but no incoming call analogous on the other brother's phone. Calls seem to have been added on different days to make the records on the day in question more convincing. At one point, the defense lawyer turned to the police detective who was on trial as the organizer of the murder and said, "Did you used to forge police records? Did you used to forge phone records like the ones we're looking at in this court?" And he said, "Yes, I did used to forge phone records, and I did a much better job than these guys did." The accusation about the police detective turned out to be from another detective who owed him a great sum of money and was consequently highly interested in putting him in jail. The FSB officer recanted his earlier statement that he had been asked to look up records. In a bizarre turn of his testimony, he said, "I'm a servant of the state. The state asked me to help out in the investigation, and I told them what they said they wanted to hear." Finally, and most devastating, I think, for the prosecution, the defense was able to introduce into evidence a video of the alleged shooter, Rustam Mukhmudov, and it just wasn't the same person as the one on the surveillance camera. They were able to introduce this video even though Rustam, the alleged shooter, was not on trial because it was in the cell phone of one of the brothers who was on trial. And I was in the courtroom during a break when they had just discovered this accidentally on Jabrail Mahmoudov's cell phone, and they were playing it for the first time in the courtroom during a break. And Ilya Politkovsky, Anna Politkovskaya's son, who was at every day of the trial and was very involved in it, obviously emotionally, and he had to watch this video, and I was standing next to him, of the Makhmudov brothers. They were near a river down in Chechnya, and they were throwing mud at each other and playing. And it was very difficult to watch for two reasons. One was this was after his mother had been shot, and to watch these people frolicking was offensive and difficult. But also it was very clear from that video that Rustam was a big, fat guy, and the guy photographed by the surveillance camera going into and out of the entryway was a thin guy, and it was not the same guy. And the jury came back with a verdict of not guilty, which is the only verdict they could have come back with. A few months ago, as with all cases where a jury does not go along with the prosecutors appeal, the higher court overturns the decision, and in this case, sometimes you have a retrial. In this case, the lower court that had tried initially sent it back to investigators to do a better investigation, but there is no confidence, there is no reason to think that they're going to come up with a better case than the one they came up with the first time. And I've spent a certain amount of time thinking about what this case meant. People were worried about all sorts of things. They were worried about the judge, that the judge was going to be in the tank for the prosecution and was going to aid the prosecution, but in fact the judge did a pretty good job. Novaya Gazeta, the great opposition paper for which Politkovskaya worked, was very worried that the other journalists at the trial were going to become emotionally involved with the defendants and were not going to cover the trial properly, but in fact the press did a very good job of covering the trial. Then, when it became clear that the jury ought to bring back a not guilty verdict, the press was worried that the jury was going to be tampered with, which often happens in jury cases. But in fact, the jury was not tampered with. So the only people who didn't do their job were the police, who are so good at framing up cases against scientists and against human rights workers, and who are so good at running sweeps in Chechnya. But they were not able to get it together to put away people who I don't think they were guilty of the things they were accused of, but they certainly knew things that they were not saying. And so you had a case where part of the system pushed back against another part of the system. I think the prosecutors wanted a guilty verdict, and the people who opposed this did the right thing and brought back a not guilty verdict. So that's an optimistic thing. Russia is not just a place where people are getting killed all the time. It's a place where people go to work, and they go to the movies, and they fall in love. But in a broader way, what happened at this trial was that you saw that everybody did their job, but the truly outstanding people were Anna Politkovskaya, the defense lawyer, and the people who killed Anna Politkovskaya. They were the ones who really did the best job. They were the most competent. And when you have a situation where the most competent, the most highly trained, and the best protected people in your society are trained killers, then you have a real problem that I don't know what you do about. Thank you.
зовут Наталья Естемирова. Я сотрудник правозащитного центра «Мемориал». Это была очень тяжелая работа. И я надеюсь, что он сам работает в таком заведении, где пытают людей, и, возможно, сам имеет отношение к пыткам. Вот это, конечно, бывают нерадостные моменты. Впервые мы сказали людям, вы имеете право обратить тех заявителей в глаза тем, кто тогда издевался над ними. Вот это было для них главным. И то же самое для всех других заявителей в Страсбургский суд. Было очень тяжело.
We're spread way out here. Okay. Hi, I'm Ann Cooper. I'm a professor at the Columbia Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. I was National Public Radio's Moscow bureau chief from 1987 to 1991, some pretty amazing years. And later, as the director of the Committee to Protect Journalists, I worked a lot on press freedom issues in Russia, which unfortunately far too often involved journalists who were killed and for whom there was never any justice found. So I want to introduce the people who are taking part in this conversation this evening about Natalia. First of all, Elena Milashina. She is a correspondent for Novaya Gazeta, and after the 2006 murder of Anna Politkovskaya, she and colleagues at Novaya Gazeta conducted their own investigation of Anna's murder. Elena also continued the kind of reporting that Anna had been doing in the North Caucasus, and over the past 2 years, Elena has published articles on the extrajudicial killings and other violent and lawless practices carried out in Chechnya in the name of counterterrorism. On the other side of Elena is Roman Sannikov, who will act as interpreter. And now I'd like to introduce Tanya Lokshina. She's the deputy director of the Moscow office of Human Rights Watch. She's a prominent researcher and advocate who has investigated a range of human rights issues, but with particular focus since 2003 on Chechnya and the other North Caucasus republics. Tanya has written 2 books on the region. She's worked on numerous human rights reports, and she was the recipient of the 2006 of the Andrei Sakharov Award for Journalism as Civic Accomplishment. I want to draw your attention to a letter that I hope is available out here that was sent today by the Committee to Protect Journalists and by PEN to President Medvedev, demanding an independent investigation into the July murder of Natalia Estemirova. In the letter, they said Estemirova had accumulated a damning body of evidence linking human rights crimes to Chechen authorities, particularly the militia of local President Ramzan Kadyrov. She was among the diminishing number of public witnesses to the human toll of the Second Chechen War. That last sentence has haunted me a little since I read it. The diminishing number of public witnesses to the human toll of that war. Throughout terrible points in the history of Russia and the Soviet Union, there have always been public witnesses methodically recording the details of state-sponsored crimes in the belief, or at least in the hope, that the truth ultimately would get out and would be the undoing of the criminals. To take up that kind of work in the era of Andrei Sakharov or Larissa Bogoraz, Sergei Kovalyov, to do that kind of work was to risk your job, to risk your freedom, really to destroy your life in the name of the greater cause of human rights. And quite understandably, not very many people had the courage to pursue that work. As a Moscow correspondent in the late 1980s, I remember seeing a moment when that really began to change, and it was at a founding meeting of Memorial in Moscow. I remember really nothing about that program because the event itself was the astonishing thing that so many people could come together in a public place and speak openly about human rights issues. But a couple of small moments remain with me many, many years later. One was an elderly woman who was standing in the hallway stopping people saying, "Does anybody remember my brother?" And saying the name of her brother, the year he had disappeared, the camp that she believed he had disappeared into, and telling this over and over in the, off chance that somebody wandering by this hall in Moscow might actually know what had happened to her brother. What's so extraordinary about this is that her brother had probably disappeared 50 years earlier, at the height of the Stalin terror, and yet all these years later there was no way she was going to give up. And my other vivid memory is not far from this elderly woman. There's a table set up, boxes, index cards, and a kid, a 19-year-old kid sitting behind there whose name was Dmitry. I don't remember his last name. There were no personal computers. Nobody had personal computers at that time. Dmitry was Memorial's computer. Actually, he was doing it on his own, but he had come to this Memorial meeting. People could come there and write out information about themselves, about missing loved ones, any information that they had, or they could rifle through the index cards in Dmitry's boxes and look and see, is my brother in there? Is my father there? It was the beginning of a database. It was very, very primitive, but it was an extraordinary thing. Let's collect all the truth that we can on these little index cards and hope that it can lead us to something bigger. And of course it did. It led to the beginning of the peeling away of the secret shroud over the atrocities of the Stalin era. And, if only that could have been the end of Memorial's job. David Remnick of The New Yorker wrote a very poignant line about Memorial at the time of Estemirova's murder last summer. Memorial, he said, started out intending to unearth the buried facts of the Stalin era. Now it concentrates largely on the present tense. And of course, it concentrates on the present tense because, alas, there is so much going on that still demands public witnesses like Natalia Estemirova, one of that dwindling number of people who were still willing to risk all to record the atrocities of the Second Chechen War. I don't know what the future holds for human rights work in Chechnya, and I think we should talk about that in a few minutes. I know that Memorial, at least temporarily, closed its office in Grozny, and one wonders, could it ever reopen? Who would want to work there? But first, I want to ask you to tell us more about Natalya. And Tanya, you in particular, I know, knew her very well. I found one article with many quotes from you. You called her amazing and inspiring, with an obsessive and unstoppable desire for justice. But you also said she was nice and funny, always smiling, somewhat coquettish. And we know that she was a history teacher. And, from what we've seen tonight and from all the articles that I've read about her, it's almost as though she was a history teacher, and then something changed, and next she was a journalist and a human rights advocate. But fill in that gap in between. I still don't understand, was there something personal in her life? Was there something in her family that moved her from her first career to her later career?
Well, I think that what moved her to her later career is precisely that craving for justice. She just could not passively watch people suffer. She felt it was her obligation to do something, to intervene, to help. Even when she knew that she was doing something extremely risky, she still couldn't stop herself. She would always try to do this, no matter what. And indeed, she loved being a school teacher. She loved her students, and I think personally that what Natasha wanted most is just to have a normal life, normal job, normal family. And because of the wars in the Caucasus, all that injustice, all that blood was just pushed into her face, and she simply had to do something about it.
She spoke in this video about her students. Mm-hmm. Did she ever speak with you about that? I mean, was that perhaps, was that her window into what was going on? The thing that, kind of put it in her face?
She did speak to me about her students quite a lot, and about how they were trying to keep the school going during the several years of very turbulent quasi-independence in Chechnya, when there was no state funding, the teachers were not getting paid, there were no books, absolutely nothing, and the teachers had to find all sorts of ways just to make it possible for themselves to continue teaching kids. She had students all over Russia, really, because so many of them left Chechnya because of the war, and they kept calling her and writing to her. I believe that it was not about her students, the very thing that made her become a human rights worker, that made her document rights abuses. It was simply about herself, seeing it and feeling that she had to do something for it to stop. I was very struck when I listened to Salman Rushdie reading out a fragment of Natasha's article about Anna Politkovskaya and the Lapin case. The way it is finished, saying, Anna is dead, and now we have to continue doing whatever she had been doing because there is no one else left and we just have to do it instead of her. That's, in a sense, what we felt when Natasha was gone. However, if you just think of the body count, it's pretty frightening. This year has been unprecedented, and I hope to God that it's going to remain unprecedented. Stanislav Markelov was killed on the 19th of January at the start of the year, and I remember so clearly Natasha coming to his funeral, and she was completely devastated. She was just so shocked. To her in particular, she was about 50 years of age, and Stanislav was just 34. He seemed to be nothing but a boy. She just could not digest it. And after the funeral, she stayed up till dawn at my flat, and she was crying, and she just kept repeating, someone's gonna be next. Someone's gonna be next. It's a war. Something is happening. And I could not agree more, because we all knew that in that situation of rampant impunity, other killings were unavoidable, but Natasha did not know that she'd be next, and I couldn't possibly know that. Then, when Natasha was being buried and her body was brought from Ingushetia to Chechnya, there was a group of people gathering next to the offices of Memorial, situated by coincidence next to the monument to slain journalists in the center of Chechen capital. And some of those people waiting for the body, waiting for the coffin to be delivered, they held up a poster, just a simple piece of white paper saying who's going to be next. And again, there was this feeling in the crowds that something else would happen. Someone else would be killed, and it was almost unavoidable, but no one really believed that it could happen very soon. Because after such a scandalous killing, there has to be a gap. There has to be a stretch of quiet. But then apparently just 3 weeks later, another 2 Chechen activists, Zarema Mukusheva and Oleg Jabrailov, were killed, having been abducted from their office in Grozny. I was in Sweden on the way to New York for a couple of days. And there I was with a bunch of colleagues from Memorial and other human rights organizations in Russia who gathered in Stockholm for a conference on security for human rights defenders. While the day before the start of the conference, Maksharip Alushev, a very prominent protest activist in Ingushetia, someone that I know quite well, someone that Elena knows quite well, was also killed in a contract-style murder. So the list keeps expanding and expanding and expanding, and you really feel that unless something is done, unless something is changed, unless the Kremlin changes something, then pretty soon there would be none. No one will remain to do that sort of work. No one will be there to speak about abuse in the Caucasus. And that's a pretty scary feeling.
Yeah. In 2008, though, Natasha felt sufficiently endangered that she did leave the country for a while. She went to England. Why didn't she do that again this year, do you think?
Well, actually, Natasha, despite all the danger, only left the country for more than a few days on 2 occasions. Both times after she had very contentious personal meetings with Ramzan Kadyrov, now president of Chechnya. It happened the first time in June 2004 when Anna Politkovskaya, who was a great friend of Natasha, was suggested an interview with a rebel fighter who had allegedly just surrendered. Politkovskaya really wanted to do the interview, but Natasha was kind of suspicious about the offer and the fact that it could not be done in Grozny, and all sorts of different arrangements. So she decided to accompany Politkovskaya, even though she knew it was extremely dangerous. She felt that she needed to be there lest something happened to Anna. They were taken straight to Tsenteroy, the native village of Ramzan Kadyrov, and Ramzan Kadyrov was there to meet them. He yelled at Politkovskaya, he used very obscene language, he was snatching her by the hand, he was shaking her. At some point, he actually wanted to strike her, and he raised his hand. And Natasha stood between the 2 of them, trying to protect Anna. After that meeting, considering that Anna left, and Natasha stayed there in Grozny because that's where she lived, we all felt that it was absolutely essential for her to get away, at least for a few months. And it was difficult to convince her, but she was genuinely frightened. And I rarely ever saw Natasha frightened. She was not frightened of bombs, she was not frightened of shells, she was not frightened of sweeps and shootings, but that meeting was way too much. And so she left for Ireland with her little daughter, and they stayed there for about 4 months. And she could have stayed longer, she could have stayed forever. Naturally, for someone like Natasha, who was very well known for her incredibly courageous work, finding a refuge abroad was just not a problem at all. But she wanted to go back because she knew that there were all those innumerable victims in Chechnya who just needed her help. And she did. Then she would always refuse all sorts of offers to go abroad. And then she had her second meeting with Ramzan Kadyrov in March 2008. At that time, she gave an interview to one of Russian Federal TV channels about the headscarf policy of Ramzan Kadyrov. And she was very critical, and just like in her article, which I read a few minutes ago, she stressed that it was not Ramzan Kadyrov's business to force women in Chechnya wear headscarves, that this was up to the woman, this was up to the family, and the policy was unfair, the policy was humiliating. It was aimed at trying to put the women down. Kadyrov was maddened by that particular interview. So he summoned Natasha, he screamed at her, he threatened her, he asked her all sorts of questions about her relatives in Chechnya, her daughter, and then after this meeting, which lasted for over an hour, we again were able to convince Natasha to leave. And the very fact that she agreed to go to England for a couple of months indicated that, once again, for the second time, she was really very frightened. Also, once she returned from England at the end of the summer, she actually sent her daughter to the Urals, to Yekaterinburg, to stay there with her relatives, because she felt that after that rendezvous with Mr. Kadyrov, it was absolutely out of the question to have the child in Chechnya.
Elena, the letter that CPJ and PEN sent today to President Medvedev says that Novaya Gazeta suspended staff trips to Chechnya after Natasha's murder this summer, and that the reason was that they couldn't ensure reporters' safety. When was the last time that you were there, and do you expect that you will go again? Do you agree with the ban that Novaya Gazeta has put on reporter trips?
Okay. Well, you know, we cut our covering, make it less. Our covering of Chechnya when Natasha was alive, actually, because she had another meeting with another very dangerous guy and very close person to Kadyrov, the major of Grozny. His name is Kuchev, and he is the one who probably has something to do with the murder of Anna Politkovskaya, to make you feel how dangerous these people are. Well, Natasha met him, he was threatening her, and we just decided not to put Natasha's name on the stories from Chechnya that we published in Novaya Gazeta, and to make less stories than we actually could, because though everybody in Russia and in Europe and even in USA said that there is a stability in Chechnya and the region there was peace there, and Kadyrov did a great job and Putin did a great job and the war is over. It's just means only one thing in Russia. When you don't hear the bad news, it just the media doesn't work. There is no freedom of speech, and that's the only thing, because people will still continue to be killed, tortured, kidnapped in Chechnya, and we, believe me, have a lot of news to write about Chechnya, but we stopped to do this because it was dangerous. First for Natasha, because nobody, like Tanya said, could get her out of Chechnya. And actually the last week of her life, we were there in Grozny. It's the answer to your second question, when I was the last time in Chechnya. Well, the problem is I had to go to Chechnya. It was forbidden in our newspaper, but I had to go there to meet Natasha, first of all, and to do some job, but I didn't tell it to my editor, and just went there by myself. And I went there twice. This summer, first time, it was the week before Natasha was murdered. She was kidnapped in the morning. People saw it. Nobody called the police. Everybody knew who did it. Everybody knows in Chechnya who does that, actually, who kidnap people, who kill them. We were talking with Natasha that she should go away. It just was the major subject to talk about. And well, we were laughing, making jokes on it. And Tanya wrote a great article about the last few days of Natasha when they're talking about, and she told Natasha that it's a shame that she didn't want to go, take time and write a book. And Natasha, believe me, she had a lot to write about. And Tanya told a joke that it was really a shame to die without a book, just with a few articles of her, just. And we left on 14th of July. And I didn't wake her up. We were at night till 4 in the morning. She was sitting at the computer. I was talking to her, disturbing her, and just didn't let her to write her piece to the Human Rights Watch. And Natasha was, she went asleep, and I woke on 14th of July. I wake up really earlier to say goodbye to Natasha. And I remember it was hot days in July. She was in a white skirt and a white blouse, very beautiful. And I hugged her and told her that I'll see her. She was going to Moscow. I didn't wake Tanya up, and she asked me, why didn't you do it? She wanted to say goodbye to Natasha, and I said, well, you will have plenty of time to see her. And next day, she was kidnapped and shot. It was 3 bullets in her chest, 2 bullets in her head. And the last time in the summer I was in Chechnya. For other 2 times I was on her funerals, and in August I told my newspaper that I had to go, and there were 3 of us who went to, in Russia we say goodbye to people who died several times, first on the funerals, then in 9 days, and then in 40 days. And it's very important tradition for us and for Muslims also. And we went there on 40th day. Tanya asked me to do that because she was afraid, but he had to. And I said, oh yes, I am going. We went there. It was a birthday of second president of Chechnya, or maybe third, I don't know, Ahmad Kadyrov, the father of Ramzan Kadyrov. And at this day, we came, 3 of us came to the grave of Natasha to say goodbye to her and to be there with her daughter, Lana. And Putin came, ex-president Putin came to Chechnya the same day. And he was like in 15 minutes from us. He was in the cemetery of Centroy, the village of Kadyrov tape. And he was on the grave of Ahmad Kadyrov grave. He was saying to him goodbye, and well, not goodbye, but he was not celebrating, but remembering the day of his birthday and telling his son Ramzan Kadyrov how great he does in Chechnya, and just a peaceful, very great piece of land that tourists are welcome. Just go, guys, have a rest there, and so on. And he was like 15 minutes away from Natasha's place where she lies now on the cemetery of her village, a family village. And of course he didn't even thought to come there because she was his personal enemy, because she was a personal enemy of President Kadyrov. These guys have common enemies, actually. Anna Politkovskaya was also a personal enemy of each of them, of Putin and Kadyrov, and these two are responsible for what's going on in Russia, what's going on in Chechnya, and for every murder that is not investigated and will never ever be while Putin is in charge of this country, while Kadyrov is in charge of Chechnya. And there will be more deaths, and we understand it, but we continue to do that because it's the only thing we can do. It's the only weapon we have. And like Natasha wrote, after Stanislav Markelov was killed, it's a war. And definitely the state is not on our side.
Natasha's colleague said that at the time of her death, she was investigating a sharp rise in kidnappings and extrajudicial killings. Who are the targets? Who runs afoul of Kadyrov? Is it possible to live in Chechnya and live without fear if you avoid the red line areas?
Well, it's a very good question. Apparently, this rise of violence in Chechnya, this past spring and summer, has to do with the fact that, first of all, the number of insurgent attacks increased dramatically. Secondly, Kadyrov is hysterically reacting to that rise in insurgency because he is trying to demonstrate to the Kremlin that he is able to suppress it, that he is effective, that he is still needed. He seemed to be, quote unquote, successful in 2007 and 2008 from the viewpoint of actually suppressing insurgency. But this new rise in insurgency is definitely a failure. So what he is trying to do is to deprive the insurgents of any sort of a base of support. And therefore, he is going after their relatives, he is going after their friends, he is going after anyone who could be potentially suspected of having any connections or any sympathy for the insurgents. And the kind of cases that Natasha documented before she died, the kind of cases that I was documenting in Chechnya in the summer 2009 are about extrajudicial executions, house burnings, when houses belonging to relatives of alleged insurgents are being torched and sometimes destroyed completely, burned to the ground, unlawful detentions, torture, disappearances, and even demonstrative public executions. When people who are suspected of being collaborators with insurgents are killed in front of others, in front of their co-villagers, to show to the co-villagers what could happen to anyone who would help insurgents. And violence has escalated tremendously in Chechnya in the past half a year. The reason insurgents are so active these days, in fact, is that the number of young men that join them in the woods and mountains has actually increased. And some of those young men, they just feel they have no way out. They are humiliated, they are oppressed by the sort of a regime that Kadyrov established in Chechnya. They had, for example, prior records of detention. they were tortured, and they knew that if there is any kind of an attack, if there is any kind of trouble, their names are in all the databases of the law enforcement and security services, so they're going to be the first ones to be picked up, put in a local detention, tortured, possibly disappeared. And for them, there is just no way out. Plus in Chechnya, if you're unhappy about something, it's not like you can express your protest. There is absolutely no independent media. Civic society has been completely exterminated. If you try to organize a rally, it's, well, a suicide, to say the least. In fact, what immediately comes to mind is when Elena and I traveled to Chechnya for the 40-day anniversary since Natasha's murder, I spoke to quite a few people that I knew in Grozny who were friends of Natasha, who worked for different Chechen non-governmental organizations, and I asked, well, listen, why don't we just do something like a small, well, not for the demonstration, but kind of gather around that monument for slain journalists and just stand there quietly with their portraits for about 10 minutes. And each and every person that I spoke to, and they were very courageous people, really. But each and every one of them said, this is lethal. You can't do that. If we try something like that, we are going to be killed. And, you know, when you imagine a society where it's actually impossible to commemorate your friend by standing silently with his portrait, without any speeches, without any public criticism, just stand there quietly with a portrait of a person who was recently killed, it is really quite devastating. So in that sort of a society, there's young men, there's teenagers, because the new generation of insurgents are boys of 16 to 19 years of age. They cannot express their frustration. There are no venues for it. And in fact, the only thing that remains to them is to run off to the mountains. Mm-hmm. And that's what Ramzan Kadyrov is trying to fight. And he fights it by means of destroying their homes, by means of destroying their families, and by means of preventive violence, as cynical and as crude as it sounds. And as for the Kremlin gives Ramzan Kadyrov a free rein. He's never punished for those lawless, for those horrible, violent practices. He's never even reprimanded, for that matter. And just like Elena said, I think it was very symbolic that we actually coincided with Prime Minister Putin in Chechnya when we were visiting Natasha's grave, and he was there with Ramzan Kadyrov, the Chechnya president, showing his full backing, showing his full support.
Mm-hmm. You say, can you imagine a society where someone could not take part in a silent protest like that? Yes, of course, the Soviet Union, people going to Pushkin Square and being arrested immediately upon unfurling a banner. Is that where Chechnya is now? Is there anyone left who's monitoring human rights?
Not really. In fact, Natasha was the only person based in Chechnya who dared speak up. There are other activists in Chechnya who do extremely important work, who document cases, but they never speak in their own voice. They would pass the information on to Moscow-based researchers or foreign researchers or journalists. They would make it possible for others to use this information, but they would never make the demands to the government themselves because of possible repercussions, because of unavoidable repercussions. Natasha was different. And once in a while she had quite bitter rows with her leadership at Memorial simply because they felt she was not careful enough, she was saying too much. But I think that, like Soviet dissenters indeed, who chose to live as free people in an unfree state, Natasha needed to speak in her own voice. She needed herself to be heard. She needed to protest, not only to pass the information quietly under the table to people like Lena and myself, but she wanted her voice to be heard. And that's what she died for. And what also comes to mind is that Lyudmila Alexeyeva, a very prominent former Soviet dissenter and now head for the Moscow-Helsinki group, the largest human rights organization currently active in Russia, for years, and I used to work for her, I was director of the Moscow-Helsinki for a while. Every time things were getting very depressing, and the situation with human rights in Russia has been deteriorating rather steadily and dramatically since 1999, well, since Putin came to power roughly. Every time things were getting very depressing, she would go like, "Oh, come on, darling. If you compare this to the way things were in the 70s, it's just nothing. We'll make it. It's really nothing. You just have to judge by comparison." Well, these days, Ms. Alexeyeva is actually saying something totally different. She says, well, and at least in the 70s, when people were protesting, fighting for justice, speaking their mind, they were being put to jail. Now people are being killed. And hearing something like that from someone like Alexeyeva is next to unbearable. With her experience and with all those years, decades that she spent on human rights work, and with all her unyielding optimism, she is suddenly asking herself that question, what have we come to? Mm-hmm. At least back in the Soviet Union, in the 70s, in the early 80s, it was about a jail term, not about being shot dead in the street.
I'm reluctant to close this on such a pessimistic note, so let me ask you quickly, do you see a place, a way to build pressure for any kind of change here? Is there any solution? Is there anything to be done at this point?
If Putin and Kadyrov will be dead, I think Russia will make it. I don't think right now there is reason to be optimistic, but you know what? It's not reason to give up, and we'll continue to do what we do. And I think my country, well, it had bad times, a lot of bad times, a huge amount of bad times. Sometimes it should be better. And well, I hope. And there is a hope. Because there is such people, well, look how many people have been killed in Russia. And all of it are good people. And we have a lot of good people. And I think there is not any possibility to kill all of them.
Tanya, any prescriptions?
Well, it's just that the situation today is really such that unless some systemic pressure is rendered on the Russian government, we'll just keep going to funerals. We'll just keep going to funerals of our friends. And what I mean by systemic pressure is not about ad hoc statements by different governments, including the US governments, along the lines of we are very much concerned, we call for an effective investigation, we are indignated and all that, but about specific questions regarding the progress of those investigations into the killings. And think about it, Politkovskaya has been dead for 3 years. We still don't know. There are still no answers to those questions. It's soon going to be a year since the killing of Markelov. We don't know the answers. As concerns the investigation into Natasha's killing, while both Elena and I met with the investigators, working on the case. And this is somewhat reminiscent of the situation with the investigation into Politkovskaya's murder. At the start of the investigation, when you talk to them, you feel that they're doing a good job, they're actually asking the right questions, they're moving in the right directions, but considering what happened with the investigation into Politkovskaya killing, how certain can we be that these people are not going to be stopped from doing a good job in the end? And unless these killings, the killings that already happened, are investigated properly, unless the perpetrators are held accountable, we will simply face other such killings in the future with the gaps between killings growing shorter and shorter. And this is exactly what's happening today. Because impunity as such is a sort of inspiration for future perpetrators who just knew that they can't get away with it because others got away with it so easily, time and again. So it's about asking concrete questions about the investigations into those murders. It's about asking concrete questions about the situation of human rights defenders in Russia. It's about pushing the Russian government to foster a bearable climate. I'm not even saying favorable climate, trying to be realistic here, but at least a bearable climate for human rights activists and independent journalists to continue their work. Because without them, there is frankly no civil society.
Okay, Tanya, Elena, thank you.
Yeah, I just want to thank all of you to come here, to listen to us, to remember our friends. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I just want to take a moment and especially thank Elena and Tanya for coming all this way and bringing, I think, and Keith and Salman and Michael, the people who killed Natalia Estemirova didn't want you to hear any of the things that you heard tonight. And by coming, you defied them, and I really appreciate you coming. If you could take the time to write a letter, you'll show them that they were not successful and that Natalia's voice was heard. It's very important. So please do that. Sorry about the technical glitches, but we will put on our website, links to the YouTube videos that have the interviews with her. They're quite stunning. Again, thank you all very much for coming.
Sorry, that didn't work out. Oh, I don't know what was wrong with it. Yeah, she'll figure it out later.